I was sitting in my car in a church parking lot in Columbus, Ohio, in the dress I'd bought 3 months earlier for a wedding I'd just been told I wasn't allowed to attend. The ceremony had started 11 minutes ago. I knew because I'd been watching the clock on my dashboard the way you watch something you can't stop even though watching it hurts. Through the tall arched windows of St. Michael's Episcopal Church, I could see the warm glow of candles and the silhouettes of 200 guests settling into their seats. My daughter was somewhere inside that building in a white dress, about to become someone's wife. And I was sitting in a parking lot in the cold, in a pale green dress with a tag still on it, because she had asked me not to come. The words she'd used on the phone 3 weeks earlier were calm and deliberate, the way Amanda always delivered difficult things, like she'd rehearsed them enough times that the feeling had been drained out completely. "It would just be better if you weren't there, Mom." I had not cried when she said it. I cried later, alone in my kitchen, but not then. I was too stunned to cry then. My name is Linda Hartwell. I'm 59 years old, and I have lived in Columbus, Ohio for most of my adult life. I raised Amanda here, in a small 2-bedroom house on the east side that I bought on my own after her father and I divorced when she was 7 years old. Richard and I had been married for 9 years, and when it ended badly, the way things do when two people who should have spoken honestly to each other for years finally run out of patience for the silence at the same time. He kept the house we'd shared. I found the one on the east side. Amanda split her time between us for the next 11 years, and I told myself for most of those years that the arrangement was working, that she was adjusting, that the slight distance I sometimes noticed in her when she came back from her father's was simply a child recalibrating between two different households. I told myself a lot of things during those years that I now understand were less about truth and more about survival. When you're raising a child alone and working 2 jobs to keep the lights on, the truth is sometimes a luxury you defer until you can afford to look at it clearly. Richard remarried when Amanda was 12. Her name was Donna, and she was everything about a woman that photographs well and impresses people at dinner parties. Polished, confident, the kind of person who always seems to know the right thing to say in exactly the right moment. Amanda took to her quickly, faster than I expected, and I told myself that was a good thing. A child having more people to love her is always a good thing. I believe that still. What I didn't understand at the time was that Donna wasn't simply adding herself to Amanda's life. She was quietly, methodically repositioning herself within it, the way a plant will slowly redirect its growth toward whatever light source is most available. By the time Amanda was 15, she was calling Donna Mom at Richard's house. I found out from Amanda's school counselor, not from Amanda. That was the first time I understood that something was shifting beneath the surface of our relationship that I hadn't been given the information to address. I want to be honest with you about something because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves a clean narrative. I was not a perfect mother. I worked too much during Amanda's childhood, sometimes missing things I should have been present for because the alternative was missing a rent payment. I was tired in ways that probably made me less patient than she needed on evenings when she came home from her father's house already emotionally full from a weekend with Donna's curated version of family life. I was not warm in the effortless way Donna appeared to be warm, because warmth had never come effortlessly to me the way practicality did. I loved my daughter fiercely and completely, but I expressed it more in showing up and staying than in the language she apparently needed to hear it in. I understand that now, sitting in a church parking lot in a dress I bought for a wedding that started 12 minutes ago without me. Understanding something too late is its own particular kind of grief. Amanda called me to tell me she was engaged on a Tuesday evening in March. She sounded happy in a way I hadn't heard from her in a while, genuinely light, and I felt that happiness for her the way you feel the sun after a long winter, all at once, and without reservation. His name was Tyler Morrison. She'd been dating him for 2 years. He was a structural engineer, kind and steady from everything she described, the sort of man who thinks carefully before speaking, which I privately thought was exactly what Amanda needed beside her given how quickly she herself moved through decisions. I told her I was thrilled. I asked when I could meet him. She said soon, casually, the way people say soon when they mean eventually, and I noted it without saying anything. When I finally did meet Tyler, 3 months after the engagement, it was at a restaurant dinner that felt slightly arranged, like a meeting with a prescribed agenda rather than a family getting to know each other. Tyler was exactly as described: kind, thoughtful, easy to like. His father couldn't make it that evening. I wouldn't meet Robert Morrison for a long time after that. The wedding planning began immediately, and I was included in exactly the way you include someone you feel obligated to include without actually wanting them there. Amanda sent me emails about venue options. She forwarded me catering menus. She texted me photos of flower arrangements with question marks attached, and when I responded with genuine enthusiasm and opinions, she replied with single-word answers that closed the conversation rather than continuing it. Meanwhile, from what I gathered through the edges of our phone calls, Donna was deeply embedded in the actual planning, the venue visits, the dress appointments, the cake tastings. I never said anything about this directly. I told myself it was fine, that blended families navigate these things imperfectly, that Amanda had two mothers in her life, and dividing attention between them was genuinely complicated. I kept showing up to the conversations I was included in and pretending not to notice the ones I wasn't. I kept doing that right up until the phone call 3 weeks before the wedding that I genuinely did not see coming. She called on a Wednesday night. I remember because I'd just gotten home from the grocery store, and I was putting things away when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I answered the way I always answer her calls, with something lighter in my voice than I usually carry, the particular hopefulness that never entirely goes away no matter how many times it's met with disappointment. She was calm. That was the first thing I noticed. Not nervous, not apologetic, not the slightly guilty version of herself she sometimes became when she had to deliver something difficult. She was simply calm, the way someone is calm when they've made a decision they've fully settled into. "Mom, I've been thinking about the wedding," she said, "and I think it would just be better if you weren't there." I stopped with a can of soup in my hand. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. "I mean, I think it would be less complicated," she said. "For everyone." I stood in my kitchen with a can of soup in my hand and asked my daughter to explain what she meant by everyone. She explained it the way people explain things they've thought through very carefully, in complete sentences, without gaps for the other person to interrupt, covering the likely objections before they can be raised. It would be emotional having both her mothers present. It would create tension on a day that should be simple and joyful. She didn't want to spend her wedding managing other people's feelings. She loved me, she said, but sometimes love meant making hard choices. She used the word boundaries. She said she hoped I understood. I stood in my kitchen listening to my daughter dismantle my presence at her wedding with the language of self-care and emotional management, and I understood, with a particular clarity that only complete shock can produce, that this had been decided before she called me. This wasn't a conversation. This was a notification. I asked one question. Just one. "Did Donna ask you to do this?" The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to answer the question without her saying a word. She said no. I believed she believed that. I'm not sure I believe it myself. What I know about Donna, after 22 years of watching her operate within the edges of my daughter's life, is that she rarely asks for things directly. She creates conditions in which the people around her arrive at the conclusion she prefers while believing they arrived there on their own. She is exceptionally good at this, genuinely, in a way I can acknowledge without pleasure. Whether this particular conclusion was one Donna manufactured or one Amanda reached independently after years of absorbing Donna's perspective on our relationship, I genuinely don't know. What I know is that I hung up the phone after that call, finished putting away my groceries in complete silence, sat down at my kitchen table, and did not move for a very long time. The soup can sat on the counter. I never actually put it away. I told my sister Pat that same night. Pat is 4 years older than me, has lived in Cincinnati her whole adult life, and is the kind of person who responds to injustice with immediate and practical fury, which is both comforting and occasionally exhausting. "You're going anyway," she said immediately before I'd even finished the sentence. "You can't not go to your own daughter's wedding." I told her Amanda had asked me not to. "She's wrong," Pat said flatly. "She's your daughter. You were there first. You go." I spent 3 weeks going back and forth on exactly this question, turning it over every morning and every night, trying to find the right answer in the space between what I wanted and what Amanda had asked for. 3 weeks of trying to figure out whether respecting your child's wishes means honoring a request that costs you more than you know how to calculate. I drove to Columbus on the day of the wedding without a plan, without a speech, without any clear idea of what I was going to do when I got there. I parked in the lot of St. Michael's and sat there while the ceremony started without me. 14 minutes into the ceremony, there was a knock on my passenger side window that made me jump so hard I knocked my knee on the steering column. I turned to see a man I didn't recognize standing beside my car, tall, silver-haired, somewhere in his early 60s, wearing a dark suit with the particular ease of someone who'd worn them his whole life. He wasn't a parking attendant. He wasn't anyone I could place. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read, not alarm, not irritation, something more like careful attention, the way someone looks at a thing they're trying to confirm before they say it out loud. I lowered my window. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice low and calm. "I saw you sitting out here, and I wanted to check, are you all right?" I told him I was fine. "Thank you, just waiting for someone." He nodded slowly, not moving, studying my face with an expression that had become something other than polite concern. "I don't mean to be strange," he said carefully, "but what is your name?" I told him. "Linda Hartwell." I said it the way you say your name to a stranger, reflexively, without thinking about why he was asking or what the answer might mean to him. The effect it had was immediate and completely unexpected. Something moved across his face, recognition, but deeper than that, almost like the resolution of something he'd been trying to figure out for longer than this parking lot conversation. He took one slow breath. "You're Amanda's mother," he said. "Not a question." "Tyler's father," he said then, extending his hand through my car window. "Robert Morrison." I shook it, more out of automatic courtesy than conscious decision. Robert Morrison. The man I hadn't been able to meet at that restaurant dinner 14 months earlier. Tyler's father. My daughter's new father-in-law, standing in a church parking lot on his son's wedding day, knocking on the window of a car where the mother of the bride was sitting alone in a dress she hadn't been supposed to need. He looked at me for another moment. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, and the gentleness in the question was the thing that almost undid me, because it wasn't the sharp version of the question, the accusatory one I might have expected. It was the genuine version, the one asked by someone who actually wanted to understand what they were looking at. I told him the truth. I don't know why I told him the truth. I'd been rehearsing a version of it that was vague enough to protect Amanda and honest enough not to humiliate myself completely, and I'd intended to use that version if anyone from the wedding asked. Instead, I told him the real version, sitting in my car with the window down and the November air coming in cold, while his son married my daughter somewhere inside a church whose candles I could still see glowing through the tall windows. I told him about the phone call. I told him about the 3 weeks of turning it over. I told him I'd driven here without knowing what I was going to do, and I'd apparently decided to sit in the parking lot and let the decision make itself. He was quiet for a long time after I finished talking. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. 19 minutes, I told him. I'd been watching the clock. He nodded once, his jaw tightening in a way that told me something was moving behind the controlled expression, something with more force behind it than he was currently showing me. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to hear it before I say anything else." He paused, choosing his words the way his son apparently did, with that particular deliberateness that comes from understanding that words land differently depending on how they're arranged. "I grew up in the city," he said. "Went to school on the South Side. My mother worked 2 jobs my whole childhood, one at a laundromat on Parsons Avenue, one cleaning houses for families in Bexley on weekends." He watched my face to make sure I was following. I was. "There was a woman who lived on Livingston Avenue who let my mother bring me along when she was too young to leave home alone on Saturdays. Sat me in the kitchen with cookies and a book and never once made me feel like I was anything other than a welcome guest. I was 6 years old, and I still remember her name." My throat tightened before he said the next part. "Her name was Eleanor Hartwell," he said. "She was your mother." The world got very quiet around me. Not the church parking lot kind of quiet, with distant traffic and November wine through the window. A deeper quiet, the internal kind, the kind that happens when something reaches a part of you that you didn't know was still open. My mother, Eleanor Hartwell, who had lived her whole life on Livingston Avenue and died 11 years ago at 81, still in the same house she'd raised her children in, who had fed half the neighborhood's children at one point or another across 50 years of living on that street. My mother, who I thought had no connection to this man or this wedding or this parking lot. Robert Morrison was watching me with an expression that was no longer carefully controlled. "She was one of the kindest people I ever encountered in my life," he said quietly. "And I have thought about her more times than she would have believed." I sat there with my hands in my lap and absolutely nothing to say. He told me that he'd recognized my last name when Tyler first mentioned Amanda's family, and that he'd filed it away without saying anything, not wanting to make assumptions based on an unusual surname. But then Tyler had told him my first name, and Tyler had mentioned that my mother had lived on Livingston Avenue, and the pieces had come together in a way he'd been quietly carrying since the engagement. He hadn't said anything to Tyler, or to Amanda, or to anyone because it felt private, like something that belonged to him and to a memory of a woman who had been kind to a small boy on Saturday mornings decades ago, and sharing it felt like it might diminish something he'd kept carefully intact for 50 years. He hadn't expected to find me sitting in the parking lot of the wedding. He'd stepped outside for a moment of quiet before the reception, spotted the car, noticed someone sitting alone in it, and come over out of nothing more than basic human concern. "Come inside," he said. It was not a question. "I wasn't invited," I told him. "I know," he said. "Come inside anyway." I sat there looking at him through the open window, measuring the thing he was offering against the thing my daughter had asked of me. "Amanda asked me not to be there," I said. "She had her reasons." Robert Morrison looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man who has lived long enough to know the difference between a person protecting their child and a person making excuses for behavior that shouldn't be excused. "I understand that," he said carefully, "and I respect that you're trying to honor what she asked. But I'm asking you now, as Tyler's father, as the other parent at this wedding, to come inside. You can stand at the back. You don't have to walk down any aisle or make any announcement. But you should see your daughter get married." My hands were shaking. I looked down at them, and then out through the windshield at the church, at the warm light in those tall windows, at the building where everything that mattered was happening without me. I thought about my mother sitting a small boy down with cookies and a book on Saturday mornings without once making him feel unwelcome. I got out of the car. I'm still not entirely sure what combination of grief and courage and Robert Morrison's certainty produced that decision, but I got out, straightened my dress, and walked across that parking lot beside a man I had known for 19 minutes who had been carrying a piece of my mother inside him for 50 years. The church doors were heavy and old, the kind that open with a weight and a sound that announces you. Robert pulled one open slowly, with the particular care of someone who understood exactly what was at stake in the next few seconds. We slipped inside into the back of the nave, into the dim warmth at the far edge of the last row of pews, and for the first time that evening I saw my daughter. Amanda was standing at the altar in the most beautiful dress I had ever seen her wear, her back to me, her hand in Tyler's, both of them listening to the officiant speak words I couldn't quite hear from the back of the church because my blood was too loud in my own ears. She looked like herself and completely unlike herself at the same time, the way people do at the moments in their lives that are large enough to transform them while they're still standing inside them. I watched her shoulders, the specific set of them that I'd known since she was an infant, and I felt something that I don't have a single clean word for, a mixture of pride and grief and love and loss so thoroughly braided together that separating any one strand from the others was impossible. Robert stood beside me without speaking. He simply stood there, which was exactly the right thing. The ceremony continued around us, and I watched my daughter become Tyler Morrison's wife from the back row of a church I'd almost never entered, standing beside a man who'd known my mother when he was 6 years old and had come to find me in a parking lot because he thought I should be there. Whatever force assembled that particular combination of circumstances, I have no adequate explanation for it. When the officiant said the words that made them husband and wife, and Tyler kissed Amanda, and the room filled with the specific warmth of 200 people releasing the emotion they'd been holding through a ceremony, I cried. Quietly, completely without intending to, the way you cry when something bypasses every defense you've spent weeks carefully constructing and reaches you anyway. Robert noticed, but said nothing, which was the correct response. He handed me a pocket square without comment, the way people do when they've spent enough time around important moments to understand that sometimes the kindest thing is the practical one. I pressed it against my eyes and then held it in my hand and watched Amanda and Tyler come back down the aisle together, faces bright, the particular happiness of people at the exact beginning of something. She didn't see me. She was looking at Tyler, then at the crowd reaching for her hands on both sides of the aisle, laughing, glowing.
She didn't look toward the back.
The guests began filing out for the reception, which was being held in the adjoining hall of the church. Robert stayed beside me as the crowd moved around us, patient, not pushing me toward any decision. I stood against the wall and honestly had no idea what to do next. I had watched the wedding. I had done the thing Robert had asked, and some part of me understood that simply being present for it, even from the back row in the dark, had given me something I would have spent the rest of my life mourning if I'd stayed in the parking lot. But the reception was another question entirely. Walking into a room where Amanda would see me, where Donna would certainly be, where every social arrangement of the evening had been built without accounting for my presence, that was not the same as slipping quietly into the back of a church. Robert seemed to understand this without my saying it. He turned to me when the room was nearly empty and said, "Give me 10 minutes before you decide anything." Then he walked toward the reception hall. I stood alone in the empty nave of St. Michael's and waited. The church was almost completely silent with everyone gone. Candles still burned at the altar, and the flowers, white roses and eucalyptus, something Amanda had mentioned months ago in one of those emails I'd responded to with enthusiasm she'd met with single words, filled the air with something clean and soft. I sat down in the last pew, the one Robert and I had stood beside, and I looked at the altar where my daughter had just gotten married, and I let myself feel the full weight of everything that had gotten us to this moment without trying to manage or organize it. 22 years of raising her. The divorce she'd been too young to fully understand. The East Side house I'd bought alone. The 2 jobs that kept the lights on and sometimes kept me from being as present as she needed. Richard and Donna and their polished household, and the way Amanda had oriented herself toward that light across the years of her adolescence. The Wednesday phone call with the calm, deliberate voice. And then Robert Morrison, knocking on a car window, with a piece of my mother in his pocket. He came back in 8 minutes, not 10. He opened the door of the nave and walked toward me with a directness that told me whatever he'd gone to do, he'd done it. He sat down in the pew beside me without preamble. "I spoke to Tyler," he said. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "The truth," he said. "That his grandmother-in-law was one of the kindest people I ever met in my life, that her daughter is sitting in an empty church having watched her own daughter's wedding from the back row because she wasn't made to feel welcome, and that I thought he should know that." I closed my eyes briefly. How did he respond? Robert was quiet for a moment.
"He didn't know," he said.
"About any of it. He knew there was tension between Amanda and you. He didn't know you'd been asked not to come." Something in my chest shifted. Tyler hadn't known. Whatever had produced that phone call, it hadn't been a joint decision between Amanda and her new husband. It had been Amanda's alone. Or Amanda and Donna's. Tyler hadn't known. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I was asking Robert specifically. He seemed to consider the question the same way. "That depends on Amanda," he said. "Tyler is going to talk to her." I looked at him. "That could go very badly," I said. He nodded. "It could," he agreed, with the honesty of someone who understands that some things need to be risked anyway. We sat together in the quiet of that empty church for another few minutes, 2 people connected by a woman who had offered cookies and kindness to a small boy on Saturday mornings half a century ago. I thought about my mother constantly during those minutes. About what she would have said to me if she'd known I was sitting in a parking lot while my daughter got married inside a church. Eleanor Hartwell had not been a woman who sat in parking lots when her family needed her. She had not been a woman who accepted exclusion quietly and called it respect. She had been a woman who opened her door wider when things got complicated, not narrower. The door to the nave opened again, and this time the person who came through it was not Robert Morrison. It was Tyler, my new son-in-law, still in his wedding suit, his tie slightly loosened in the way it gets after the ceremony is over and the formal vigilance relaxes. He walked toward us with an expression I hadn't seen on him in the limited times I'd been around him, something tighter and more serious than his usual measured composure. He stopped in front of the pew where Robert and I were sitting. He looked at his father first, then at me. "I didn't know she asked you not to come," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know you didn't," I told him. He sat down across from us, not the seat beside me, the one across the aisle, like he needed to be able to look at both of us while he figured out what came next. "I don't know what happened between you and Amanda," he said carefully. "She doesn't tell me everything about her family situation, and I've always respected that. But she's my wife now, and you're her mother, and you're sitting in an empty church."
He stopped.
"That's not okay with me." Those 5 words, "that's not okay with me," were the simplest possible version of the thing I'd needed someone to say out loud for a very long time. Not to Amanda, not to Donna, not to Richard, but to me, directly, clearly, without managing it or softening it or wrapping it in the language of complexity and blended family dynamics. Someone had simply looked at my situation and said it wasn't okay. I had to work very hard in that moment to maintain my composure, because the alternative was falling apart in front of a man I'd met twice and his father, who I'd known for 30 minutes, and neither of those things felt appropriate at the reception of the wedding I hadn't been invited to. "I appreciate that," I told Tyler, keeping my voice steady with the particular effort of someone who has had years of practice at keeping their voice steady. He nodded. "I need to talk to Amanda," he said. "Before I do, I want to ask you what you want. Because I'm not going to make decisions for you about your own relationship with your daughter." The question landed in the empty nave and sat there waiting for an answer I'd been unable to arrive at for 3 weeks. What did I want? I wanted to have been invited. I wanted the phone call to have never happened. I wanted 22 years of raising my daughter to have been enough to earn a seat at her wedding that didn't require someone else's intervention to secure. I wanted my mother to still be alive, so I could call her from a parking lot and hear her tell me what Eleanor Hartwell would have done in my position. None of those things were available to me in the pew of St. Michael's Episcopal Church on a November evening while my daughter danced at her reception 30 feet away without knowing I was still in the building. "I don't want to create a scene at her wedding," I told Tyler. "This is her day. Whatever happened between us, it's still her day, and I won't ruin it." He nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked you," he said gently. "What do you actually want?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I want my daughter to know I was here," I said finally. "Not to confront her. Not to make her feel guilty. I just want her to know that I loved her enough to come, even when she asked me not to, because some things are bigger than the instructions you're given." Tyler held my gaze and then nodded once with the deliberateness of a man who has just made a decision and committed to it completely. He stood up, straightened his jacket, looked at his father briefly in a way that communicated something between them that I wasn't entirely meant to read, and then walked back toward the reception hall. Robert and I sat in the silence he left behind. "He's a good man," I said quietly, not because it needed to be said, but because the silence needed something in it. "I know," Robert said. "I got lucky."
He paused.
"Amanda got lucky too." We sat together and waited, and the waiting had the quality of something that had already been set in motion and could no longer be stopped, only witnessed. I don't know exactly what Tyler said to Amanda in that reception hall. I wasn't there for it, and in the months since I haven't asked for every detail because some conversations between a husband and wife belong to them, and I've learned, at significant cost, the price of believing that everything that affects me is therefore mine to fully know. What I do know is that 11 minutes after Tyler walked back through that door, it opened again. And this time it was Amanda. She stood in the doorway of the nave in her wedding dress, the flowers in her hair slightly loosened from the evening, her face doing something complicated that I recognized because I've been watching her face do complicated things since she was 7 years old, and her world split into 2 households.
She saw me.
I sat very still. The way you sit when something you've been hoping for is suddenly right in front of you, and you're afraid that any movement will alter its trajectory before it arrives. She walked toward me slowly, down the center aisle of the church, in her wedding dress alone. Robert stood up quietly and excused himself before she reached us, with the grace of a man who understands exactly when he's finished being needed and exits accordingly. Amanda stopped a few feet from the pew where I was sitting. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and in that silence I read about 17 different things simultaneously: guilt, defensiveness, something that might have been relief, something that was definitely not entirely surprise. She'd known, some part of her, that there was a chance I might come anyway. Maybe she'd hoped for it. Maybe she'd feared it. Both things can be true at once, and usually are in situations this complicated. "You came," she said finally. "You asked me not to," I replied, just as quietly. "I know," she said. She sat down in the pew across from me, the same one Tyler had sat in, her dress pooling around her on the old wood, and she put her hands in her lap and looked at them the way she used to when she was a child who'd done something she already knew was wrong before anyone told her. "Tyler told me his father found you in the parking lot," she said. "Yes," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "How long were you out there?" "Almost half an hour," I told her. Something crossed her face at that, quick enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching as carefully as I was. She nodded slowly. "Mom," she started and then stopped. And it was the stopping that told me more than anything she might have said next, because Amanda does not stop in the middle of sentences. Amanda finishes every sentence she starts, always. It's one of the most consistent things about her, since she was old enough to form complete thoughts. The fact that she started and stopped meant that what came after the word mom was something she hadn't scripted, something she'd arrived at in this pew in real time, and I sat very still and gave her all the space she needed to find it. "I don't know how to explain it in a way that makes it sound like something other than what it was," she said finally. "So, I'm not going to try." She looked up at me. What I did was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it. I told myself things that made it feel less wrong, and some of those things are complicated, and some of them are real, but none of them are enough. "You're my mother. You raised me. You should have been in that church." The honesty of it was so clean and direct and undefended that for a moment I didn't know what to do with it. I'd been preparing, in some corner of myself, for a version of this conversation that was more defended, more qualified, more filtered through the language of self-protection she'd been using more frequently in recent years. Instead, she gave me the plain version, without softening, and I understood that Tyler had said something to her that had removed whatever scaffolding she'd been using to hold the defended version up. "Did Donna ask you to exclude me?" I said. It was the question I'd asked on the phone call, and she'd answered with silence. She was quiet now too, but a different kind of quiet, the considering kind rather than the caught kind. "No," she said. "Not in those words." A pause. She said certain things over a long period of time that I absorbed and eventually turned into a decision I told myself was mine. She looked at me. I think it was mine in the end. I think I let her plant seeds and then I watered them myself, because it was easier than figuring out what was actually between us. The clarity of her self-assessment was startling, and I recognized Tyler's influence in it, the way his particular kind of careful honesty had probably created space for hers. Whatever he'd said to her in that reception hall in the last half hour had reached something in Amanda that years of our circling each other had never quite accessed. I sat with everything she'd said before responding. "I need you to hear something," I told her, making sure my voice was steady enough to carry the weight of what I wanted to say without it coming across as accusation. "I know I wasn't always the mother you needed me to be. I was tired. I was stretched. I missed things I should have been present for. I know that." She nodded, listening. "But I was there," I continued. "I was always there. Not perfectly, not always in the ways you wanted, but I stayed and I showed up and I worked 2 jobs for most of your childhood, and I never once let you go without anything you actually needed. And I know that's not the same as what Donna's house felt like. I know it was easier and shinier over there in ways that my East Side house wasn't, but I need you to know that what I gave you was everything I actually had." My voice held, mostly. She was looking at me with her eyes very bright, and I recognized the specific way Amanda looks when she is fighting tears, the particular tightening around her eyes, because I taught her that expression by accident when she was small, and watching me use it.
She cried.
Not the controlled, managed version, the real version, the kind that bypasses whatever composure a person has spent their adult life constructing, the kind that belongs to something much younger and less defended than the polished woman in the wedding dress sitting across from me. I moved to the pew beside her and put my arm around her, and she leaned into me the way she used to lean when she was small, and the world had done something to her that was too large to process alone. We sat like that in the empty nave of St. Michael's, my daughter in her wedding dress, and me in the pale green dress with the tags I'd forgotten to remove, while the reception continued, without us 30 feet away. At some point Robert's face appeared briefly in the doorway, checking, and then disappeared again. Tyler's father, carrying my mother's kindness forward 50 years, standing guard at the door while Amanda and I found our way back to something we'd both been too afraid to reach for directly. We talked for a long time in that church, long enough that the candles at the altar had burned noticeably lower by the time Tyler came to find us. He stood in the doorway again, reading the room with the perceptiveness that I was understanding was one of his most consistent qualities, and then he came and sat beside Amanda, on her other side, without saying anything, just present, just there. The three of us sat in a pew together in the quiet, and I thought about all the ways this evening could have gone differently. If Robert had not come outside, if he had not recognized my name, if my mother had not given cookies to a small boy on Saturday mornings in 1974. The particular chain of circumstances required to produce this specific moment was so improbable that sitting inside it felt like something other than coincidence. Amanda reached over and held my hand. Her wedding ring was cool against my fingers, brand new, not yet broken into the shape of her hand. Tyler spoke, first, eventually. "My dad told me about your mother," he said. "About the Saturdays on Livingston Avenue." I nodded. "She was remarkable," I said. "Everyone on that street knew her. The door was always open." He smiled. "He talks about her like she was someone who changed things for him," he said. "He grew up in a house where there wasn't much warmth. His parents were good people, but not demonstrative people. And then on Saturdays he'd go to this kitchen where a woman made him feel like showing up was the best thing that had happened to her all week, regardless of what was actually happening in her own life." I thought about my mother making that small boy feel welcome in her kitchen. I thought about the Saturday mornings of my own childhood, the smell of that kitchen, the particular quality of my mother's attention when it was on you, the way it made you feel accounted for. Eleanor Hartwell's kindness, extended 50 years ago without expectation of return, had walked through a parking lot tonight and knocked on a car window. Amanda squeezed my hand. "I want you to come to the reception," she said. Not as a question this time. An invitation, plainly stated, on her own terms, her own decision. I looked at her. "What about Donna?" I asked because it needed to be asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Donna is going to have to manage her own feelings," Amanda said. Like an adult. Something in her voice was different from the girl who'd called me 3 weeks earlier, with that deliberate calm. Tyler's influence again, I suspected, the particular solidity of a person who had found someone willing to be honest with him and had consequently become more honest himself. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Yes," she said. Then, quietly, "I'm sorry it took sitting in a parking lot for me to get here." I squeezed her hand back. "You got here," I told her. "That's what matters." Walking into that reception beside Amanda was one of the stranger experiences of my life. The room was everything the wedding planning emails had promised, beautiful, warm, full of people already deep into the particular happiness of wedding receptions, that specific combination of sentiment and relief and champagne that makes these events feel briefly like the world is working exactly as it should. People noticed us walking in together. Some of them, I would later learn, had been told by Donna that I wasn't coming, that there had been a falling out, the vague narrative that covers a multitude of specific sins. The expression on Donna's face, when she saw me enter beside Amanda, was something I will not describe in detail because she is Amanda's stepmother and Amanda loves her, and whatever I privately thought of that expression is mine to keep. Richard was beside her. He looked at me with something more complicated than Donna's expression, something that had guilt inside it, which told me more than I needed to know about the full picture. Robert Morrison found me near the edge of the room about 20 minutes after we'd come in. He had a glass of champagne and he handed it to me without asking if I wanted one, which was the correct move. "How are you?" he asked. "Honestly," I told him, "I have absolutely no idea." He smiled at that, a real one, the kind that reaches the eyes. We stood together for a moment watching the room, watching Amanda and Tyler move through their guests, watching the particular ease between them that told me Tyler was exactly what I would have wished for her if I'd been allowed to wish for anything. "Thank you," I told him. He shook his head. "Your mother was kind to a boy who needed it," he said. "Whatever I did tonight doesn't touch what she did." We were quiet for a moment. She would have liked you, I told him.
He looked at me.
I hope so, he said. She sounds like someone worth impressing. Amanda danced with Tyler, and then Tyler danced with his mother, and then someone found me near the edge of the room and said Amanda was asking for me. I walked out to the dance floor, not knowing what was about to happen, and Amanda held out her hand. We danced together, my daughter and I, at her wedding reception, in a room full of people who'd been told 20 minutes earlier I wasn't going to be there. It was not graceful. Neither of us are particularly graceful dancers, which is one of the many things we have in common that we don't always acknowledge. We stepped on each other's feet twice and laughed both times, which was also something we had in common, the ability to find what was funny even inside what was painful. I put my hand on the back of her dress, the dress I hadn't been involved in choosing, and I felt my daughter in my arms the way I'd felt her when she was very small, and the world felt simple, because we were the whole of each other's world. We were quiet while we danced, both of us, because what needed to be said had already been said in a church pew in the dark. Donna approached me once during the evening. I'd known she would, because Donna is not a person who leaves things she can't control simply uncontrolled. She came while Amanda was occupied with Tyler's family on the other side of the room, the timing deliberate in the way Donna's timing always was. She told me she was surprised to see me, with the particular cadence of a woman who is saying one thing and meaning several others simultaneously. I told her I was glad I'd come. She said she hoped everything would be smooth for Amanda going forward, which was the sentence's way of suggesting that my presence was historically a source of unsmooth things. I looked at her for a long moment and made a decision that I want to tell you about because it might be the most deliberate decision I made all evening, including the one to get out of the car. I decided not to engage. Not because I was afraid, not because I lacked things to say, not because Donna held any power over me in that room after what had already happened that evening. I decided not to engage because Amanda was across the room in her wedding dress, and this was her night, and nothing I said to Donna in the next 2 minutes was worth 1 degree of complication to that. I smiled at Donna pleasantly and said, I hope so too, and then I turned and found Robert Morrison nearby, which was either coincidence or the deliberate positioning of a man who'd been watching to see if I needed a graceful exit from a conversation, and I joined him instead. He didn't ask what that had been about. He handed me a small plate of food from the nearby table and said, "The salmon is very good," and I ate the salmon and we talked about his son's career and my mother's garden until Amanda came to find me again. Some battles are won by not fighting them. At the end of the evening, just before Amanda and Tyler left for the night, she found me near the coat check putting on my jacket. She put her arms around me without saying anything first, a long hug, the kind that doesn't have an agenda or a message to deliver, just presence. I held on. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright again, and she laughed slightly at herself for it. "I'm going to call you when we get back from the honeymoon," she said. "We need to actually talk. Really talk." "I'd like that," I told her. She looked at me for a moment, taking me in, the way people do at the end of significant evenings when they're trying to store the image of something that mattered. "I'm glad you came," she said. It was the plainest possible version of the most important thing. I watched her walk back to Tyler, who was waiting near the door, and I watched them leave together, and I stood there in the coat check line feeling something settle in my chest that had been unmoored for weeks. Robert walked me to my car. It was past 10, and the parking lot was cold and half empty. The cars of the last remaining guests scattered across the pavement where 2 hours earlier I'd sat alone watching the clock. My car was still where I'd parked it, the front wheel slightly crooked in the space the way it gets when I park in a hurry, which I had been when I pulled in that evening in a state I couldn't entirely name. We stopped beside it, and I turned to him. "I don't know how to thank you," I told him. He shook his head the same way he had inside. "Eleanor Hartwell fed me breakfast on Saturday mornings for 3 years when I was a boy," he said. "She never asked for anything in return. She never suggested I owed her anything. She just kept the door open." He paused. Keeping the door open for people who need it seems like the right thing to pass along when you have the chance. I thought about my mother with her door open on Livingston Avenue, and about this man standing in a parking lot having kept it open on her behalf half a century later. I drove home to the east side that night with the heater running and the radio off, and I let the evening move through me without trying to organize it into the clean story it would eventually become. It wasn't clean yet. Amanda and I had not fixed anything in a church pew. We'd opened a door that had been shut, which is different, and the things on the other side of that door still needed to be walked through one at a time over whatever time it would actually take. Richard and Donna were still the figures they'd always been in the background of our relationship. The Wednesday phone call still happened and couldn't be unhappened. But I'd watched my daughter get married. I'd danced with her at her reception. I'd held her hand in a pew while she cried and told me the plain truth about what she'd done, and that plain truth, delivered without defense, was the most honest thing she'd offered me in years. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table and looked at the soup can still on the counter from 3 weeks earlier and finally put it away. Amanda called when she and Tyler got back from their honeymoon, as she'd promised. We talked for 2 hours, the first 2-hour phone call we'd had since she was in college. She told me things she'd been carrying for years, the specific shape of her confusion growing up between 2 households, the way she'd learned to manage it by orienting herself toward whichever environment asked less of her emotionally, and how that habit had followed her into adulthood without her fully tracking it. She told me she'd been in therapy since before the wedding, that Tyler had been going with her for the last several months, that they were both trying to understand the patterns they'd brought into the marriage before those patterns became too expensive to address. She asked me to consider it too, not as a condition, just as something she thought might help both of us find a clearer way to each other. I told her I'd think about it. I started going 2 weeks later. Robert and I have stayed in touch. He lives in Bexley, not far from where my mother's house used to stand on Livingston Avenue, and we've had coffee twice since the wedding, easy conversations between 2 people who arrived at each other through the strangest possible circumstances and found they had more to talk about than either expected. He told me more about the Saturdays in my mother's kitchen, specific details I hadn't known, the particular things she'd said to him across those years that had stayed with him, the way she'd talked about her own children with an uncomplicated pride that he'd absorbed and tried to carry forward with Tyler. I told him things about her too, things a child knows about a parent that nobody else does, the private textures of her life inside the house on Livingston Avenue. We've been trading her, in a sense, across the table at a coffee shop in Bexley, building a more complete picture of Eleanor Hartwell between the 2 of us than either of us had alone. Amanda and I have lunch once a month now, just the 2 of us, a standing thing we established after the first long phone call and have kept without exception for 8 months. We're not yet fully what I would want us to be. There's still distance in certain places, still topics that require more care than they should, still moments where I feel the specific shape of all the years we spent circling each other in the language of managed emotions rather than direct ones. But we're building something, honestly and consistently, one lunch at a time, which is the only way anything worth having actually gets built. She told me last month that Donna had said something to her about our renewed closeness, something with the texture of concern about it, and that Amanda had told her directly and without much ceremony that her relationship with her mother was her own business. She said it matter-of-factly, like reporting a minor administrative decision. I held that quietly the rest of the afternoon like something valuable. There is a photograph from the wedding that Tyler had printed and sent to me. In it, Amanda and I are dancing. You can see that we've just laughed about something. Her head is slightly back. My eyes are bright with it. Both of us mid-laugh in a way that makes people unguarded and completely themselves. Her dress catches the light from the reception room, and my pale green dress is visible at the edge of the frame. The tags finally removed before I walked into that room, a detail that makes me smile every time I notice it. I have it on my kitchen table. Not hung on the wall yet, just on the table where I can see it when I sit down in the morning. I think about Robert Morrison finding me in a parking lot. I think about my mother giving cookies to a 6-year-old boy without any expectation of what it might eventually mean. I think about how far forward a single act of ordinary kindness can travel when it's offered without condition and received with gratitude. Eleanor Hartwell kept her door open for 50 years and never knew it would walk her daughter into a wedding. If this story reached you, please share it with someone who needs to know that some things find their way home no matter how long the road gets.